How's it going, everybody, and welcome to episode 281 of Master My Garden podcast. Now, this week's episode, we're looking at the subject of flowering shrubs, and I'm going to go through a list of the 10 top flowering shrubs. Well, a list of 10 great flowering shrubs, and let's not call them top because that's people's opinions, situations, gardens, and so on. But the reason I wanted to cover this was obviously perennial borders over the last few years have become, they're all to go, and they're they're absolutely fantastic. But I think within the context of that, and when you see a lot of the gardens that are being created now, the the flowering shrub is getting kind of overlooked a little bit and maybe underutilized, underused. And even if you reference back to the episode a couple of weeks back with Tom Coward, he's talking about Gravetye Manor and how they have these borders, but they're underpinned with strong shrub presence. And what shrubs give you, particularly in the context of a perennial border, is that they give you something it's going to give you, well, number one, it's going to give you flowering at different times of the year, but it's also going to give you a bit of structure, something more permanent than perennials. As you know, perennials, they come up in the springtime, nice lush growth, and then they flower, generally speaking. You're going to start your perennial border starting to flower in sort of May-ish, maybe a little bit earlier. You tend to rely on things like bulbs for your colors prior to that, and then it'll continue flowering through the right choices of perennials right through to the end of October type time. And shrubs, flowering shrubs, as I say, they've kind of got overlooked a little bit. And what ends up happening is they they get forgotten about, and then because they're forgotten about, or because they're less purchased, then you see less of them in garden centers. So it's good to kind of it's good to kind of remember them and try and not think of them. Shrubs generally, try and not forget about them. There's fantastic ones out there. Like, the list is endless. I'm going to talk about 10 today, maybe some other notable mentions, but and some of these would be considered, I guess, old-fashioned in in today's terms. But if you think about it, there's a lot of shrubs and plants that go through their phase in the limelight. And just even thinking back to 15, 20 years ago, say, bottle brush was everywhere. You couldn't go into a garden center without seeing beds and beds of bottle brush. In a lot of garden centers now, you'd do well to find one. In fact, I'd say you probably wouldn't in a lot of them. And now I don't have any problems with that because I wouldn't overly like them. But the point I'm making is that various various plants have their period in the sun. And over the last few years, that has certainly been Hydrangea Annabelle. Everybody's talking about it. It's in every garden center. Fantastic flowering shrub, obviously. Um, but there's others, and the beauty of the correct choice is that these are going to give you several things. They're going to give you structure within a bed. Some of them will have multiple interests in that they're structurally quite nice, but obviously they have the flower. But again, through choice, you'll get a lot of these to flower, when you just won't have any flower in your perennial border. They can also be really, really strong, standout statement pieces, statement trees within a border or at the edge of a bed. And all of those, they have so many benefits from that point of view. Then there's some of them that are, hugely supportive to biodiversity. They're fantastic flowers. They work well in different situations. So some like full sun, some like shade. And then there's categories of plants that are just, really, really interesting. And I'm going to go through a list here. As I say, some of these will be, in today's terms, considered old-fashioned, but at the same time, they shouldn't be overlooked because they do have huge benefit within the garden. Before we get onto the list, it has been a fantastic week weather-wise, back to, really, really warm temperatures. And growth is phenomenally strong at the moment. We've had, kind of moisture as well. As last week we were talking about fluctuations in temperatures and rain and so on. And this week we're talking about, quite high temperatures, quite warm weather, nice spells of sunshine, but also a couple of showers here and there. And at nighttime, kind of, really heavy dews. So there's moisture in the ground, which means that there's a phenomenal amount of growth. And it has been really, really, really lush time in gardens. You'll see that everything is really growing strong and growing really well now. So yeah, that's kind of the context of the week. Every week it's kind of interesting to see how things change and how quickly things can change. But yeah, at the moment we're experiencing what we would call here almost a little mini heat wave, and yeah, it's really, really welcome. So to get into the flowering shrubs, as I said, some of these now are going to be seen as old-fashioned, but they're all beautiful, given different periods of interest. And as I say, it's a list of 10. Some you'll agree with, some you won't. If you don't, good. I had a call out last week to say, anyone that was listening to the podcast to give me a shout, let me know that you're there, send me an email, send me a message, and I've got a good few people, actually a couple of requests for different episodes, which I will cover over the next couple of weeks. And lovely to hear from new listeners, a couple of new listeners this week who have just got into the podcast recently. As I said, there'll be some episodes featuring their questions over the next couple of weeks as well. But let me know on your list of flowering shrubs, something that's not there that should be there, anything that's you know, missing from the list, or anything that, in your opinion, gee, why did you put that in there, John? That's not a good shrub. So yeah, it's always interesting to hear these. As I say, it's not a top 10 because it's a list of 10, and it won't be for everyone. Mightn't suit your garden, mightn't suit your situation, but they're 10 solid performers, each of them worth their place in most gardens. So to start off, I'm going to start with one that is quite popular at the moment, one that is in a lot of garden centres. It featured hugely at bloom in a lot of the show gardens, and it's Cornus kousa. So Cornus, there's the flowering, they're dogwoods, flowering dogwoods are the coloured stem dogwoods. The coloured stem ones, they look nice in the winter time. Other than that, they can look like a nice feature if they're block planted. It kind of gives an interest, a winter interest in terms of color, these bright reds or these really kind of vibrant yellowy type stems. But the flowering cornus, these are they're fantastic. They're absolutely gorgeous. Actually, the flowers on them are technically not flowers, but we won't get into that. They're leaves or bracts as such. So and the main one, and the one I'm going to mention here, is Cornus kousa. There's some brilliant varieties out there. Cornus kousa China Girl is one that you will see a lot of the most popular nurseries in Ireland and garden centres in Ireland stocking. It's one that featured heavily, as I say, at bloom, and timing wise, it was looking fantastic. Really nice, strong, good, strong plant, will perform in most gardens. Again, an ideal type feature plant. So if you have, a bed that flows, and maybe there's a focal point on that bed, a corner or a standout piece, or at the back of a border, a Cornus kousa China Guard can look really, really good, especially over time. When they've reached full size, they can get up to, kind of 3 meters by 3.5 meters in height, so quite wide and quite tall. So it can be a large shrub, but it's a fantastic, beautiful, beautiful shrub, flowering shrub. Although technically not flowering, but as I say, we won't worry too much about that. It flowers in May and June, and hence the reason why it's featured so heavily at bloom. But it is definitely one for the moment. I don't have one, but I do. I will be getting one, a new bed, or a bed that's been revamped, I guess, over the next couple of months. That there's definitely going to be a big a big Cornus kousa going in there. So Cornus kousa, and there's loads of others. Cornus mass. There's loads of loads of really good flowering ones. And if, as I say, a lot of the nurseries and will have them, and they'll have them at this time of the year. Um, you'll see them at this time of the year in flower, so that's kind of a good gauge. But any of these, you can get them at any stage of the year and then have them ready to come out in your garden at the appropriate time next year. So number two on the list is definitely one that's going to be seen as a little bit old-fashioned, and it's fuchsia. So fuchsias in Ireland, there's parts of the country where they kind of run wild along hedges and so on. And then years ago, you would have had certain varieties that would have been planted. They can get very, very big. But the one thing about fuchsias, doesn't matter what variety or which size, so you have like the big bush varieties that really can get very, very big, up to 2, 3, 4 meters tall. And there is ones that can be kind of grown as hedges, and they have their place as well. But generally speaking, the flowers are really, really interesting. So they have these flowers that hang down. I'm sure most of you know them, flowers that hang down with these really long stamens that come out of them. And they're just a really interesting flower, and they're so intricate. And there's a mountain of varieties, like thousands of varieties. You can get them as bedding fuchsias, which again have a really interesting flower, the same type of flower that I'm talking about here. But in terms of the shrub or the hardier varieties, there's some phenomenal ones. The best ones for a garden situation are the kind of shrubby varieties. Something like a tom, which grows really, really small, is typically fairly hardy. They they won't take a really deep frost, but they're fairly hardy for most of the time for most of the country in Ireland. But they're just a really, and again, I acknowledge that this would certainly be seen by a lot of gardeners as old-fashioned. But in terms of a flower, there's very few flowering shrubs that have flowers that are as interesting as this. They don't have any value necessarily for pollinators. They typically are not scented, typically. Um, but generally speaking, they're a fantastic looking flower, and something that is really interesting. Hardy, will grow in most places. The range of colors are typically, you can have white, pink, purple, and there's several, like maybe 6 different shades of pink, purple that you can get. So it's always a mixture of those, but they're really, really interesting flowers. They flower, typically speaking, August, September, even into October. And then there's a huge variety of sizes available. So as I said, it can get up to really big bushy plants, like 3 meters tall. But the likes of Tom that I mentioned, that will stay at kind of 40 centimeters in a nice little small shape, relatively hardy, but has that nice feature of a flower. And it's just an interesting flower, and something that's, kind of different to what you'll see at the moment. As I say, potentially might be seen as a little bit old fashioned, but really, really nice. From a bedding plant perspective, I know you can get them as bedding plants, but from a bedding plant perspective, they're brilliant in hanging baskets because, the flower hangs down, as I said. So you don't necessarily get the full beauty of it while looking down at it as it's facing downwards as well. But when you put it into a hanging basket or a window box that's up higher than the eye level, and you're looking upwards at it, then you get the true beauty of the flower. And that is, they're a fascinating looking flower. So yeah, fuchsia number two. And again, I think that one a lot of people might think that shouldn't be on the list. But it is a really good one. Another one that is, in my opinion, severely underused in these days. If you went back, I would say 30 years ago, there was hardly a garden that didn't have a forsythia in it. Um, Nowadays, they're seen as old-fashioned. They are a little bit scraggly looking, so they don't suit, people look at them as untidy. But they are a fantastic flower, and they're giving you a flower kind of before the rest of your garden starts to flower. And that's why I think they can be really, really beneficial. Again, I would view it a little bit like the Cornus. I would view it as something that stands on its own. You don't block plant these necessarily. It stands on its own in a particular spot. You allow it to take up that limelight at that time of the year. It can get big, so they generally can get, 2 meters, 3 meters. They're quite woody looking on the stems, so they're not a compact, tidy looking plant necessarily. But when that's in full flower in March, April time, they really do put on a show. That vibrant yellow. A brilliant variety is one called Beatrix Farrand. It's difficult enough to get in Ireland. There is some garden centres, stroke nurseries with them, but you won't see it everywhere. And it's one that will go to 2 or 3 meters tall. But when that stands on its own in a particular spot that you can see, that draws your eye to it, you will see a massive yellow at that time of the year, and it will be in contrast to a lot of what else is going on in your garden, especially if we get a really cold spring when things are just not waking up the way they normally would, and then you just get this massive vibrant yellow flowers. And for that reason, I think it's one that's really worth having in most gardens. Then on to the next one. Again, it's this one now is it's going to be liked and available in most garden centers at certain times of the year. And it's Daphne. And there's a load of different varieties, and they really do, they really do stand up. Again, they're giving you flower when nothing else is really flowering. So Daphne will flower, depending on variety, January, February, March, April, potentially into May. So at that period of time where everything else is looking fairly grim, except for a few bulbs, different bulbs here and there, you can have the likes of a Daphne in flower, and that for me is a huge win. And this is where mixing the likes of these through your perennial border gives you something different. So your perennial border obviously prime the whole way through the summer and into the autumn. But in those winter months, so November, December, January, February, March, April, those months can be quite bleak looking at a perennial border. And the likes of these shrubs just give you something to catch your eye, a bit of colour, a bit of vibrancy at that time of the year, and that's why they win. There is a lot of varieties. Um, Probably one of the best ones is Marisium ruba. It's very good one. Again, its size wise not too big. We'll go to 1.2, 1.5 meters, and that's a brilliant plant. There's loads of other Daphnes. You can get them really miniature, like that will grow to 40 centimeters, and then bigger again up to 2, 3 meters. Different Daphnes will suit different situations, but they're all giving you that kind of really early season flowering, and for that reason, they're again worth having in your garden. Number five is one that's probably nobody's going to disagree with too much on the list. It's hydrangea, but Hydrangea paniculata, and there is again a lot of varieties here, really good ones. Limelight. There's the one that's kind of recognizable by its name, Pinky Winky, but they're all very, very good, very good, very prolific flowers, and quite strong when planted in blocks together. So if you have them down along a walkway on either side, they're tall, going, two to 3 and a bit meters, and they kind of have arching foliage with flowers on them. So again, as I say, on both sides of a walkway, you can have these kind of flowers that are kind of leading you down a walkway or a driveway or something like that. They're fantastic. They get really big. They flower prolifically, and they're flowering again while your perennial border is kind of at its peak. This is when you'll have these, but they are such a standout on their own, and they're not going to be ones that you will typically put into your, say, perennial border, but they're ones that you will use as a block planting or a feature to draw you through an area. Ideal along, certain paths or things like that through your garden. But a brilliant one. Hydrangea paniculata, and recommended variety Limelight, which is quite commonly got. The really white, vibrant flowers, they typically can have a pink hue towards the start and towards the end of it. But they're a beautiful, really big flower, a standout plant. The next one, again, I'm going for one that's going to give you this kind of this early, this really early flower, because I think these are, as I say, they're going to give you that interest when there's not much else giving that interest. And this one is quite well known. It's Hamamelis mollis, and witch hazel, commonly known as. There's some brilliant varieties of it. Pelida is probably one of the best. But the flowers themselves are really, really interesting. So, like I said, with the tom tom or the fuchsias in general, they have really, really interesting flowers and flowers that you don't really see on that are, don't have a similar flower to anything else. And I think that kind of makes it a standout, makes it a little bit of an interest. And that's why you'll see a lot of them at that time of the year. So they flower really, really early. You're going to get flowers from them in sort of January, February, March, that sort of time frame, depending on where you're living and depending on what variety you have as well. But they're going to be really unusual, really nice at that time of the year. And they're hardy, will grow in most areas, like most situations. Just a brilliant, reliable flower. When you get them in the early years, they're small, and maybe then the flowers don't last overly long, and the flowers themselves are kind of delicately, almost spidery like looking. And in those early years, they can be a little bit underwhelming, but when they fully form, when they get big, when they when they create a substantial large shrub, then that flower becomes way, way more interesting and quite stunning at that time of the year. Especially nice on a frosty morning where you get, the white ground and then this flower just pops. It, really, really does stand out. So that's a really good one. And you can see here there's kind of a theme, I guess, where I am kind of stitching in a lot of winter and early spring color here. So that was number 6 on the list. And number 7 on the list is again flowering this period. This one will definitely be seen as old-fashioned to a certain extent, and it's Mahonia. So there's loads of them. Mahonia Media Charity is probably the most well known. But again, it has a kind of an interest from lots of perspectives. Now, these can get very big depending on what variety you get. So you can get them again in miniature varieties that will only grow maybe 2 to 3 foot tall or, up to a meter tall. But you can also get really, really big ones that are going to grow kind of 3, 4 meters tall, maybe a meter and a half to two in width. So really big, big solid um, shrubs, large shrubs. And so they do need a bit of a play of a space. They prefer to be in shade, but they will do really well in sun as well. But the one thing they do like is moist, humus rich soil. If they have that, but they don't have good drainage, then they don't tend to do well. So you want to have good drainage, but humus rich soil. So make sure you're mulching around them quite a lot. But that's a brilliant one. It's in terms of flowering, it's yellow and yellow only. You don't get anything else. But again, the flower is quite big and it's flowering at a time of the year where you're not getting, you're not getting much else by way of flower. Lots of different varieties out there. With the correct varieties, or a mixture of varieties, you could technically have flower from November time right through to the end of April, which is a really long period of time. Generally speaking, any of the single varieties, they are quite long flowering as well, so you're going to get flower over a couple of months. But with a combination of a couple of varieties, the early ones, some of the later ones, you can have flower for that long period of time, which is really, really useful. They are quite big though. The leaves themselves are interesting looking, not particularly nice looking in my opinion, but they are interesting looking. They look a little bit what word they're structural, but not necessarily a little bit untidy looking at times. The leaves themselves are big. They look kind of spiky. But all in all, it's a plant that's well worth its place because it gives you this huge pop of yellow color, especially as it matures, this huge pop of yellow color at that early part of the year. I've personally seen these with a mountain of bees on them. People will debate whether they're any good for early season pollinators or not, but I have personally seen quite a big one, and it was in a back garden in a town, and it was absolutely teeming with bees. Now it was probably February, March time. It was quite a sunny day, but it was alive with bees on a particular day, and it was really interesting to see that because sometimes people would say that they're not necessarily useful for pollinators, but that certainly was attracting the interest on that day. So that's number seven on the list. That's Mahonia. Number eight on the list is Choisya ternata. A good one. Aztec Pearl is a good one. It is, again, it's giving you that flower kind of before your borders will really kick off, and it's April, May flowering. So it's a really, really good one. Nice, interesting leaves. Can be quite good in pots as well. Size wise, again, you can get it different varieties, but typically speaking, you're going to be able to keep them nice. You're going to stay nice and small for you up to 1.5 meters in height, so they'll be quite strong in a bed, but not dominant or not overtaking it. So quite a good one. Again, giving you that slightly earlier flower, so really, really, really good one. Don't have one myself in the garden, but a really solid performer. Again, would be somewhat kind of an old style one, but again, a really, really interesting plant from a leaf perspective and from a flowering perspective. Number nine is well recognizable, and it's Buddleja butterfly bush. So there's, I suppose there's loads of varieties of this. It's known because butterflies thrive, really swarm to it. And, again, a little bit like the Forsythia, it can look scraggy. The plant itself is not overly nice looking, but you can get really brilliant flowers on it. There's one called Royal Blushed that's a really deep purple, large cone-shaped flower, and it's just, when it grows well, when it's in full flower, it looks fantastic. Now it is flowering, quite late in the year. It's going to be July, August, September is when you get your flowering. Again, suitable because that's when the butterflies hopefully will be coming out. Definitely less of them the last few years, by the way, but there's, that is the time when we will see them, and they flock to the likes of a Buddleja. There's loads of varieties. Again, it can grow quite big, but they can be kept small as well. But the Royal Blushed is a really, really nice one. Number nine on the list, then, no, that's number nine, Buddleja. Number 10 on the list is probably my favorite one on the whole list, and it's Philadelphus version on mock orange. So the I have it in the garden. I actually got it from Mary in Gash Gardens, and it's out of any plant, it has the most distinct smell. It's a beautiful, beautiful perfumed plant. The flowers, it's flowering now, so flowers kind of you'll typically get it flowering sort of early June right through to July. It doesn't last a terribly long actually flowering wise, but the smell of it is just phenomenal. It's not like, it's a different smell to say any roses that you might have or any other scented plants really. It's kind of has a smell all to its own. But on a really warm evening, if you're anywhere near that, there's a kind of a scent in the air. Uh, it kind of hangs in the air, whatever type of smell it is. It kind of hangs in the air, and it's a really nice kind of deep smell. The flower itself is beautiful, quite small, but there's loads of them. So when you're looking at it as a form shrub, and it will grow to a big shrub like this, going to get to 3 meters, 3 meters tall, about a meter and a half wide. So quite big, but it will be a mass of white flowers. And because there's so many of these, they're quite a small flower, but because there's so many of them on it, it just looks like a big mass of white. And then the scent, which is, I know I've said it, but that scent is really exceptional. And to have a kind of a seating area anywhere near that, to sit on it on a warm evening and to get that scent in the air, it's just phenomenal. So that is probably of the 10, that's my favorite. It's just a phenomenal plant. So to just go through the list again, we had a Cornus kousa, we had a Fuchsia tom again, probably seen as old fashioned, Forsythia, Daphne, Hydrangea paniculata, had Hamamelis mollis, Mahonia charity, Choisia, Buddleja, and Philadelphus. And if you have these in your garden, along with your perennials, you'll have something. You're able to extend your interest across more than the summer border, I guess. Other ones that are worth mentioning, again, some of them would be seen as potentially old-fashioned, but the likes of Cotinus, Smokebush, just some fabulous varieties of those. Again, they featured a bit at Bloom. The, you know, they look really well. Timing wise, they probably suited, but the lovely, beautiful leaves on the plant as well. The that deep purple, they're just it's a brilliant, brilliant one. Doesn't make it into the list necessarily, but one that's kind of worth looking at. Another one, again, a little bit scraggy looking in terms of growth, but Cotoneaster conubia will be seen as large shrub, stroke small tree. But again, it has seasons of interest. So you have this dark evergreen foliage, flower early in the year, and then a mass of berries. So in terms of berries, it just gives you a huge, huge covering of berries. So again, a kind of an interesting one at certain times of the year. Erica carnea, definitely overused, say 20 years ago. And as a result, people are kind of sick of them and don't put them in. But at that time, the Erica carnea, which is the winter flowering header, they were planted in blocks. So you get a flower bed and you'd have all along the front of it be Erica carnies, and then they don't do anything with them. They grow into one another and then they turn woody. And that's the memory that people have of them for at the moment, is that they remember this big woody on Thames plant that just looks horrible at the front of a bed. They do have a lifespan, and this is part of the problem. They were probably planted too much, a little bit like what's happening maybe at the moment with Hydrangea Annabelle. But they, if they're used not necessarily in blocks as singles, and they're kept trimmed and they're kept relatively small, kept fresh, they're fantastic for early season pollinators. They're a beautiful flower, really beautiful flower, and they really will pop in a bed when nothing else is, or when not much else is flowering. So they're worth their place, but again, a little bit out of fashion at the moment. Fatsias is another great one, brilliant in a pot, interesting leaves, interesting flowers, good one. Another kind of old-fashioned one is Hypericum, brilliant, really brilliant, bright yellow flower, can be used as a hedge as well, so planted tight together as a hedge. Not typically a hedging plant, but can make a really good hedge. And that yellow flower is, can be just a wall of yellow when you get it right. Spireas, again, overlooked a little bit, deciduous, most of them. And again, with a lot of different colored leaves, so nice yellow leaves, pinkish leaves, and various colored flowers as well. Again, we'll be seeing a little bit old fashioned, but quite good. And there's certain varieties there that are really good. Camellia probably should have got into the list, to be fair, because it's fantastic. The amount of camellias that have just fantastic flowers at at time at especially the earlier part of the year. They look really, really good. They're they're a solid plant, and probably would be would be appreciated in most gardens. They're brilliant in pots as well, so you can grow them quite comfortably in pots. Magnolias, I guess, as well could potentially be on the list. Then the likes of Pyracantha, really good. Struggling a bit with blight at the moment, so you have to watch for that. But they can be brilliant as well. So there's loads potentially, but I suppose the overriding idea here was to not to overlook flowering shrubs. There's so much choice out there. The list is endless. You could have hundreds of really solid performers. But it's interesting that the best gardens always have some of these featured through the gardens. They're adding this color when nothing else looks good, or they're adding a structure to borders, and they're just a support for the likes of the perennials. So perennials will do their thing at that perennial time, but these particularly the ones that give you that early season in flower. They're really well worth their place. They're structurally, then you have loads other ones that you could mention, Aurelias and all those type that will add structure within beds. So as I say, not to overlook that kind of section of plants. As I mentioned earlier, it's great to hear from some listeners last week and a couple of questions coming in. But again, keep keep sending those messages. info@mastermygarden.com. You'll find me on Instagram. You'll find me on TikTok. I don't do a huge amount on social media, but that's messages there. Send me messages there. That's where you'll find me. Um, Also, I have been putting the podcast up on YouTube. It's just, it's another place where people listen to podcasts now. The plan is to sort of start doing more with YouTube in terms of videos, instructional videos, how-to videos, and so on and so on. But at the moment, I put the podcast up there. So please go subscribe on YouTube. And yeah, as I say, keep getting in touch. It's great to hear from people. And next couple of episodes, or over the next few weeks, there's episodes which are featuring listeners' questions. So that's been this week's episode. Thanks for listening, and until the next time, happy gardening.